hope you're having a good evening so far. And we're going to have a very special talk from Kristian today. He has made it clear on the Facebook page that this talk is very important to him and very personal to him. And as you know, Kristian gives the most fantastic talks anyway, and they're always informative and entertaining. And I'm sure this one will be exactly the same. So I'm just going to introduce him. I'm sure you're all aware of him and the great work he does, but I will introduce him formally and then we can get on with it. So Kristian Lander is a filmmaker and the producer and host of the Our Curious World podcast. He has an avid interest in the intriguing and the mysterious. He has a passion for the world of the offbeat and the Fortean, arising from an insatiable curiosity that has been a driving force for him since a very young age. He's been a member of ASSAP since 2011 and is also a member of AASRA, Archaeology, Astronautics and SETI Research Association. Kristian holds a regular slot with Today News Talk Radio on Thursdays at 4 p.m. during the first hour of the Patrick Henningsen Show. Recently, he performed a credited role in the Star Trek animated graphic comic. When time permits, Kristian loves to research, produce content, and create travel video logs. So that's a bit about our speaker tonight. Over to you, Kristian, for A Mother's Haunting. Any questions, obviously put them in the chat and we'll put them to Kristian at the end. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them. Okay, Kristian.
Oh, thank you very much, Claire. That was actually very warm. Thank you very much. So I'm going to try and do a quick screen share here and make sure I can choose the right page. So let's share this. So can you guys currently see that webpage? That's our current ASSAP webpage.
We can.
Okay, cool. And I'm going to skip to what is the cover of Our Mother's Haunting. So can you see that okay?
Yes, we can. Okay,
excellent, cool. And that makes my life a little bit easier to know that everyone can see what it is we're going to be talking about tonight. So my mother, Kath, she went by various variants on that name. So she was born in 1955 and she passed away a few years ago on a date only 5 days past, but in 2016. So this was a talk I was going to give back on what would have been her birthday a few weeks ago. Unfortunately, work did not allow me that ability to do so. So here, this is what I want to present. This is Our Mother's Haunting. So this particular area here, this is my mother on the left-hand side with my sister Sarah, who hopefully might be here tonight. And this is a area of the world in the Fens. This is a place called Turves, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So the year is 1967. It's the swinging 60s are in full effect. And so some would say perhaps 1967 is in fact the best year for music. You had Hendrix come out, you had David Bowie there, you have the Beatles, and of course you have Patrick Troughton who takes over as Doctor Who. My mother is 12. My uncles are Rick and Leslie, and a relatively newborn uncle, William. So my grandfather Stanley and grandmother Madge. Stan was in the army. He spent a lot of time traveling around the country, and he was based in Aldershot for a while and Salisbury amongst them. But now, of course, he was settling down to married life. He took up a role as a HGV driver in civilian life and living in Whittlesea. Whittlesea, for those who don't know it, is a small hamlet village in Cambridgeshire. It's about a dozen or so miles outside of Peterborough, and of course, that's obviously in the Fens. And now with 4 children, the house they're living in is a very cramped affair. And from my recollection of my mum's stories, Stanley had a work colleague who was a much older gentleman, and they had a connection. I'm not sure whether they worked in the army together or whether they worked through the HGV company together, but I know that they had a working relationship. And their situation is that Mr. Turner, his wife had died, and his children had moved out, and he had a 3-bedroom house. Of course, and my grandfather and grandmother had a very small apartment. So they decided to have a mutual exchange. They swapped house. And now Mr. Turner, a widow, his wife has passed, children have gone. So a house for a retired man on his own wasn't ideal. So that happened in 1966, but 67 is when all the fun started to happen, as they say. So that road up there on the top left-hand side is a street called Burnt House Road. So my mum explained it to me. There was only 8 houses on this road back in 1967, 68. There literally was just 8 houses. So I've been down to Turves in more recent years. And I do believe those houses are the ones on the left. and the ones on the right clearly are much later builds. So, and there's no more buildings, no houses for until Whittlesea, which is, again, it's about 10 miles away. So this literally is a very small stretch of road out literally in the backwater of nowhere, really. So my grandparents had the main bedroom, my uncles Rick and Les had the middle bedroom, and my mother had the small box square room at the back, which she always said was very, very cold, and she iterated how cold it was. And the loo was a shed shack out the back. So the view of the farm's fields, as you can see, is a very distant view, pretty much in 360 degrees all around, farming fields as far as the eye could see. So the adventures for young children were not very apparent. And this is, like I said, this is Turves today, and it's still literally on one road. I mean, there was about 20 houses on there when I went and had a look. It's a single road, and it's as rural as you can get. So Mr. Turner would come over to my grandparents' house on a regular basis on a Sunday for a family gathering, because of course his family is now passed on and moved on. So they would come and gather dinner at the Lander table. There was like roast potatoes, Mum would talk about roast meats, fresh vegetables, Yorkshire puddings, all the best kind of Sunday roast that you can get, really. And Mr. Turner took a liking to my mum, who was 12 years old at the time, and gifted her his wife's dressing table and jewelry box. So, of course, these aren't exactly the pictures of those very items, because, of course, times have moved on and they've gone by the wayside, but hopefully this can illustrate what they were. So Mum described a story to me, and it's one that held a relevance to me, and one that I still carry today. So Mum described a story that she repeated many times. It's a series of events that inspired her as a young woman. On her bookcase that was awash with books, as I grew up, of books of ghosts, Hans Holzer amongst them, Clive Harold, Charles Berlitz, Strebra, and so on. So when I was coming up and I was growing up, I saw these books and I took them and I was reading them at a very young age. And that really is what inspired me in this field. So her story begins on a night where Rick is feeling unwell, and the weather is strong, she says. The tiles and the roofs used to clatter and to move around. The windows used to rattle when the wind caught up. My mother was very careful to reiterate that there was potentially an earlier start to the high strangeness. And this is basically what happened. So my parents her parents would have to leave the landing light on, as my Uncle Rick and my Uncle Les could not sleep with the light being off. Obviously, they was a bit young, a bit nervous. However, my mother, like me, it was the opposite. We like the curtains to be closed, we like the doors to be closed, and we like that inclusive darkness in order to go to sleep. And she mentions this particular night, it was cold all night, and she mentions at some point she woke up at night, sat up in bed, and she was aware that the door was open and the landing light was closed. And so the landing light was off. Thinking that there's been a power cut, this is 1967, that did happen on a regular basis. And maybe her mother had just come in the door because she heard it creak, and she called out, "Mum, is that you?" The door closes really slowly, and there's a click. There's no response. So 2 nights later, a very similar scenario occurs. The door opens, she sits up, but there's a difference. The difference is at the foot of the bed, she describes to me, there's a person. There's a person who's a woman who's unfamiliar to her. She's not part of the family. This is an elderly woman who's described as wearing a pinafore frock tied at the front, tied around the back, wearing a brown skirt. She had hair tied up in a bobble, and she comforts my mother, comforts Kath. "Don't worry, I've just come to do the cleaning, dear." And Mum describes how she went to the wardrobe with a cloth rag and gave it a wipe down, then went around the bed to the dressing table and wiped the mirrors, dusted the surface, picked up the jewelry box, and then she described to my mother about her new slippers, red moccasins with fluffy pom-poms on top. And as she watched, kind of intrigued that there's this lady who's quite warm, who's unfamiliar, who then wishes her good night. She backs out the door, and she closes the door, and then she leaves. Now, in the morning at breakfast, Kath asked who was the lady who came to clean in the night. The faces are left blank and left looking at each other, not knowing what to say or even give an answer. But her dad, my Uncle Stan, was quite, he came out of the army, so he has a very stern demeanor. He was like, "Don't talk wet." But there's a handprint on my mirror in the bedroom. it's not mine. Kath's insistence of the family home to view this handprint, so they all kind of went upstairs. They each put their palm to it, and indeed the impression was it was a different size to anybody and anyone in the house. Now, in 2018, when I travelled down to the Cotswolds in Cheltenham, I went to a place called Winchcombe, which is where my Uncle Rick lives. That story came up. The story of my mother's late night cleaning visitor came up, and Rick remembers the events quite vividly, despite being only 9. It didn't match up to anybody's, not Mum's, not Kath's, and Dad wasn't having any of it, and generally was pretty dismissed. It was pretty weird, he said. So the following night, once again, the door opened to a familiar creak, and stepped in a shuffling an old lady here to clean, and again wiping down the dresser and the cupboard, coming around the bed this time and sitting on the bed. Mum described how the bed went down with the weight of this lady sitting on the bed. And so Mum asked, "Who are you?" And she's like, "Oh, just need to sit down, just need to rest." Kicking up her feet, and she once again described her new slippers. So my mum was very keen to describe that the entity, the individual there, was very keen, very warm to say, "I've got a new pair of slippers. What do you think about these? Look at nice fluffy pom-poms on top," my mum would say. And she was a generally jolly person who was there for a natter and a chat. As was clear, and my mum would say that she was as clear as you are to me now. Before she got up, she opened the jewellery box, left the room, and wished a good night. So from my mother's account and my recollection of that, the weekend came, and Sunday dinner's preparations were underway, chopping carrots, peeling potatoes as the family all gathered and had to do these things together. Kath asked if she could tell Mr. Turner about the lady who visited her and who was coming over. And explicitly, under no circumstances, she was told, "Don't mention it, do not even talk. Sit at the table, shut up." The guest arrived, dinner was served on the table, and Mr. Turner and the parents had a chat, they had a catch-up before talking to family, before we start talking to Kath, he's talking to the brothers. "How are you? How's school?" That kind of general chat. But with a moment of hesitation, Mum said she looked at Dad, and Dad was looking extremely stern, as "Don't you mention anything." But she said very quickly, "There was a woman in my room." So Rick makes a joke then about ghosts. Stan tells Kath to be quiet, there's no such thing, shut up. And Mr. Turner asks more questions, he wants to know more details. So Mum describes the events to him, particularly the white pinafore on the front, the emphasis on the moccasins with the furry pom-poms on top. And then he describes and disclaims to everybody, "That's my wife, that's Mrs. Turner." In my mother's telling of this story, she never told me their first name, so I don't think she knew them. They were not certainly known to the family, to my knowledge. Dad, speaking up as head of the table, though, continued with a stern look of "Don't you say anything more." And I'm not sure of any more conversation that happened in that particular circumstance. With one exception, Mr. Turner presents Kath with something he believes that he said was in the jewellery box. He took out from his pocket some necklaces that he said he woke up to find on his bedside table that he believed that he had brought with the jewellery box when he gave it to her. It's the next slide. Oops. So each time Mrs. Turner's apparent apparition would visit, she would wipe down, she would clean, pick up the jewellery box, that will be left open when she woke up in the morning, and the necklaces would be gone. And Mr. Turner, the following weekend, would then bring the necklaces back. And they appeared again once a time on his bedside table. Now, it doesn't mention how many times that happened, but it was certainly very apparent that it did a number of times. So even at the young age, I figured Mrs. Turner was perhaps adopting the kind of ghostly intent of idling over incomplete tasks, such as, to ensure perhaps the necklaces stayed with Mr. Turner. Perhaps that spirit, should we say, wanted to make sure they stayed with him. And I had visions, and this is a picture of that road, of the jewellery coming out of the box and going out the window and floating up the road. And as a child, I could mentally see the jewellery kind of floating along the road and avoiding traffic, going to where his house was, because the vivid of the story that she was telling me. I wasn't really up for creating what apporting and asporting is. So for how long that cat and mouse game continued, I'm not sure. Before Mr. Turner died, as to where that jewelry is now, I don't know. But that certainly was my mum's kind of story that she kept told me many, many times. And my sister, Sarah, who hopefully was here tonight, she could verify that also that those stories were told to her too. My Uncle Rick, I did actually invite tonight to come. I'm not quite sure of his experience with the old Zoom. Hopefully he'll come and join us for the QTA. And
I am here. I'm just munching dinner at the same time.
Okay. So perhaps you could, was there any of the stories, any of the parts of that perhaps that she told you that perhaps she hasn't told me, or perhaps we have slight different variants on memory of that? Could you describe anything else that she told you regarding that?
You pretty much nailed it. What I remember, obviously, because being significantly younger than yourself, particularly the jewellery, how it would be there one night and then Mr. Turner would bring it back. That's, yeah, I think you've pretty much covered it. There's not anything else that springs to mind on the immediate. No.
That's fair enough. So I'm aware that this topic is a little short, because that of course is deliberately I wanted to encapsulate her story, really. But I wanted to include a bonus round of spookiness, as you popped up a little bit earlier. So my mum started kind of accumulating stories from the family that were about the spooky side of things. So I kind of wanted to also talk about them here as well. So, and again, my Uncle Rick hopefully would have been able to talk about them too. So let me tell you one. So one is my Uncle Les and my cousin Michael. And my cousin Michael, of course, being relatively newborn, 6 months old at the time. My mum described how a story that happened to them, where my Uncle Les took the baby, my cousin Michael, to bed, put him in the cot, put him to sleep, put dummy in his mouth, closed the door. And when he went to the bathroom about an hour later, he went upstairs after having a bit of a bump, apparently. He found the dummy on the landing outside the door with the door closed. So he went into the bedroom, and the dummy was not in the child's mouth and not in the cot. The dummy was indeed on the landing. And from what I understand, and again, this is vague memory, she told me when I was very young, this story, that the process repeated. So he, a bit confused, maybe he just took the dummy with him. So he put the dummy back in the cot, closed the door, left it, come downstairs. Bear in mind, this is the 1980s, no baby monitors or anything. And then he went to check in when he went to bed, and once again, he found the dummy back on the landing. So again, very simple, very, very benign of an experience, but one that it went round the family as a story. The other one actually involved his wife. So his wife at the same house was, story that was told to me was that my Uncle Les was at work. His wife at the time was in bed, and she related to my mother that one day she was laying in bed and she thought my Uncle Les had come home, got into bed, pulled the covers over, and was sleeping next to her. But when she went to turn around to him, there was no one there. The bed was empty. There was no individual in the bed, and that freaked her out to the point where she had to stay downstairs until he came home from work. The third story, again, is actually a personal one. Again, it's a very simple, benign story of spookiness, and that is my son, Jace. So obviously I lived at my mum's house when, after baby was born. My son, Jace, slept in a carry cot for a little while, a few months. And one time my partner and I went to bed, and we found my son not in the carry cot. Despite only being 3 or 4 months old, we found him under the carry cot. On a series of blankets and on teddy bears on the floor underneath. You have to bear in mind it's a kind of a cross stand holding up the carry cot. But he was sound asleep underneath, just laying on his blankets. And like, for the life of me, I've got no idea how a 4-month-old baby could be taken out and put underneath. But that's what happened. It was there. I don't describe it, but it was a house where some spooky things did happen. There was a particular time I can remember where my bed was facing the bedroom door, and it sounded like someone came upstairs, and I could see, looked like someone standing outside the bedroom door. I'm thinking, I've been standing there an awful long time. Is it my mum or whatever? Is she all right? Open the door. simply no one there. It was a house that was hit by lightning a couple of times. It was the top of a hill where we lived in Greenland Crescent, and we had I believe there was kind of iron ore deposits in the ground. There is my speculation, because there was.
I think there was, because our garden had that halfway point, didn't it, with the big metal gate, which eventually got hit by lightning.
The garden would frequently get hit by lightning, and so it kind of generated a bit of an interesting space to live in.
It was interesting. We used to run outside bare feet because the ground would always be warm.
Yeah.
But obviously just fresh cold water, fresh rain. It was amazing. We had some experiences in that house.
So one particular one that stands out for me is the ball lightning phenomenon. I only ever saw it once, and I was coming out of my kitchen. I was coming out of the living room into the kitchen, and I saw from the right to left, there's a kitchen window and a very small window next to that, and it literally was a crackling ball moving very slowly. Was no speed. There was no lightning and no rain that particular night, but it just levitated across the bedroom, across the kitchen window, and it kind of we had net curtains up, so it kind of cast those unusual shadows throughout the kitchen, and then there was a tremendous crash as it hit the wall. And basically, there was a wooden fence that was painted black with a kind of dark creosote. Now, I don't think anything else of it really, other than that it looked really weird, and it's the kind of thing you saw when you lived there. But in the morning, I went outside, and on the wall, the paint had, in a perfect circle, had cracked, and had changed from the blackness to the wood. It literally it had gone. The whole paint on that particular circle had disappeared from the wall. I'm putting two and two together because I didn't see it hit there, but I heard it. And that's the spooky story I guess I had when I was growing up. I was only like maybe at 16, 17 when it happened. So they're the spooky stories that kind of I wanted to explore more about the wonderful world of the strange and the unusual. So that is my stories, really. That's my mum's story. That is mine. That's kind of my beginning into the world of the unusual.
I do have just a quick story to put in there. When we lived at Grindon, when Grandad used to come round, he used to sit in a chair that was underneath the window. And Mum was in the kitchen, she was cooking, and Grandad, he used to have a habit of making you jump and shout, "Gotcha," while pointing at you. Mum was in the kitchen, she was cooking, and she just swung round to look through the kitchen door into the front room. And she absolutely swore blind. She saw Grandad sitting there pointing at her going, "Gotcha." Grandad had been passed for 2-3 years. So that's just another spooky story from one of my memories.
No, okay. So as a presentation tonight, I'd like to draw it to a close there. And if you have anything you want to ask me, feel free. So I'll stop sharing and we'll go from there.
Thank you very much indeed, Kristian. That was incredible. Thank you very much for sharing your family memories. Is your uncle here at the moment?
I did invite him. I did send him the link to. I'm not sure he is though. I didn't see his name.
I've not seen his name pop up either.
And your sister's here though. Should we make her? Yeah.
Hello.
Can we say hi? Hi, Sarah.
Hello.
Hello. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you guys too. Pleasure hearing stories.
So, which county?